All right, there's 2 steps left for this vest if you're making it wearable with closures. Okay, now what I'm going to show you first is the buttonhole. Okay, you already know how to sew on buttons, so I don't need to demonstrate that. Now if you've done your thread tracing, you're going to have stitching lines that show you where the buttons and buttonholes go. I have marked these additionally with the length of the buttonhole in order to make my buttonholes. And what you usually want is for your buttonhole to be about 1/4 of an inch longer than your button. Okay, these have 5/8 inch buttons. If you've bought the buttons the size that they've told you to for the vest, if you want larger buttons, you can do larger. I wouldn't advise smaller because then you're going to need more. If they're really big, you'll need less. This is designed to have 5/8 inch buttons. If you go up to 7/8 or larger, you might only get down to needing 4. If you get over 1.25 inches, you might only need 3. But then it's the way it's going to lay on the body is going to be a little different. If you get smaller, then you're getting into shirt buttons, your kind of look, and you'll need more. So that's a little bit of because the size of the button helps determine how many buttons you're going to need in order to have the closure not have too many gaps in between. All right, so we have a 5/8 inch button, and we want it to have about 1/8 of an inch on either side, so 1/4 inch larger. Then what we want to make our buttonhole 7/8 of an inch. Okay, so I like to make my buttonhole lines shaped kind of like an eye, so I've got a definite start and stop point. So if this is where I'm starting, 7/8 is here, and then we have a line in between connecting the two. So that gives me my stitching line as far as where to go across, and it gives me a very distinct start and stop for my buttonhole. I'm going to show you how to do the buttonholes on the Bernina. Different machines have different buttonholes. You're really going to need to look at the manual for your machine to know what to do for the buttonhole. Pretty much every single machine has a different buttonhole foot. Some buttonhole feet look very complicated because they might be long, they might have a sliding ruler, and that's because some of those you can set it on the foot to determine what length it is. You control it manually with the Bernina, so that's why I mark my front and back very clearly so I'll know where to stop and start. But there are some where you put the button in the buttonhole foot off to the side and it automatically makes it the right size for you. Digital machines, you often can plug in the size and it'll make it that way. The Bernina, though, it's manual, and it's what's called a 6-step buttonhole. So this is our buttonhole dial. It's the second dial down, and you see it's numbered from 1 to 6. And if you're going to use the Bernina buttonhole, if you're going to come in the shop and do it, I recommend there's very, very clear, very well written out steps in the owner's manual, in the instruction manual on how to do it. I recommend you just take that out and just follow that step by step. That's going to be the easiest way to make sure you get this done correctly. But one of the things you have to do is you don't want our stitch length set completely on 0, but it's going to be almost 0. So the closer it is to 0, the tighter the stitch is, and so the better the buttonhole is going to be. But if it's completely 0, nothing's going to happen. So it's really kind of between 0 and that one little half hash. And I strongly, strongly, strongly recommend that you do a couple of practice buttonholes that are not on your vest before you do your actual buttonholes. And I still will do practice buttonholes to this day, even though I've been sewing for 37 years. All right. So I've got my stitch length, and the only thing you need to adjust is your stitch length. It will do everything else for you. So I'm going to turn this to 1, and I don't know if you saw this it moved my needle and it adjusted my stitch width according to what step 1 is going to be. And step 1 is going to come down one side of our buttonhole. Now before I do this, let's talk about buttonhole feet. The buttonhole foot for the Bernina, for this particular one, is buttonhole number 3, is foot number 3. There's a little 3 on there. I don't know if you can see it, but it's got these 3 little prongs in there. And this little prong in the middle helps us lining up the center of our buttonhole for placement. All right, it's going to start at the back and move forward. So I'm going to make sure the center of my buttonhole is lining up with that center bar. I'm going to make sure that my needle is in the fabric exactly at where I want that buttonhole to start. Now it's not really going anywhere enough, so I need to make it a little longer. A little longer. All right, and I'm looking inside the hole to make sure it ends exactly where I want it to end. Now before you turn the dial to the next step, you need to make sure the needle is completely out of the fabric. So turn the hand wheel to make sure your looper is at the top. All right, step number 2, it's gonna take me back up to the top, because the Bernina buttonhole, what's nice about it is both sides get stitched the same direction. A lot of them will come down one side and then stitch back the other, and it's almost never as consistent going the opposite direction. So the Bernina buttonhole, the reason it's 6 steps is because it tracks back and then comes forward on the other side to give you a very, very pretty, very nicely finished buttonhole. All right, so that was step 2. Step 3 is going to be the bar tack across the top. You just want that 5 or 6 times, and then you'll stop that and it'll come back down the other side. Again, our needle out of the fabric, the looper up, turn to step 4, which is going to give us the other side of the buttonhole. All right, when I get back to the bottom, needle up, looper up, step 5, and that's my bar tack at the bottom end. Needle up, looper up, and then it just gives me, and then when I go to step 6, that just takes me straight up back to the top. So you finish where you start. All right, so that is what your buttonhole is going to look like. So nice, pretty, clean buttonhole. All right, I'm going to run through those steps again on the other side just so you can kind of see them. We'll just go through them one more time. All right, make sure I go back to step 1. Starting exactly on the line, lining my center up with that center guide. All right, come back to my end line, needle up, looper up, step 2 goes back up. I go right back where you started. Needle up, looper up, step 3, bar tack. Needle up, looper up, step 4, second side. Get to the end, needle up, looper up, step 5, bar tack. And then needle up, looper up, step 6, back to the top. Okay. So that's how we stitch the buttonholes. Now, here's the next tricky part. We've got to open them so we can use them. And you've got a couple of options here. You can use a seam ripper, or if you have some nice sharp small point scissors or snips, you could use those. What I like to do is I like to take a straight pin and put it across the end of my buttonhole, just inside the bar tack. Okay, because one of the worst feelings in the world is when you're trying to open up a buttonhole, because right now it's not functional. Now it's just a pretty decorative thing. We have to open up that little slit inside to be able to put a button through, okay? So something I have done in my life, and one of the worst feelings is when you go to cut this and you go too far and you cut into your fabric. Putting a pin at either end of your buttonhole prevents that from happening. All right, so seam ripper method. So inside the U-bend of your seam ripper, that's actually a blade. So what you can do is with that flat point of your seam ripper, you can put that into your fabric between the 2 rows of stitching, and carefully, because you want to cut the fabric in between, you'd want to avoid cutting those stitches. You can slide that blade along. And I actually like to start at the end and go in toward the middle. I can take those out now. And now I can get a button in it. Ta-da! All right, these actually got a little long. They're more like 1 inch than 7/8. But now if you have sharp snips, these might not be as sharp as I thought. And different people, again, have different preferences. Depends on how the quality of your tools, and it depends on how comfortable you are using them. All right, so that is buttonholes, and that is how you do them. If you've got heavier fabric, you might need your buttonhole, the satin stitch, set longer. Thinner, shearer, you might need them shorter. All right, I'm going to do one on my vest. So you've seen me do the samples, and ideally you'll want the sample on a scrap of your fabric that you're using for your vest, so I recommend that you kind of keep some of that. I forgot to keep some, so I used a different scrap. But all right, so step 1. All the way down, and your buttonhole just goes a little bit past your center front line. Your buttons will be sewn exactly on that stitching line. Needle up, looper up. Step 2 goes back. And again, generally you want to have fabric that matches your vest for this. If you want a big contrast button color, you can't. Buttonhole color, you can. Usually use a matching color. There's my bar tack. Needle up, looper up. Step 4, come back down. Needle up, looper up. Step 5, bar tack. Needle up, looper up. Step 6, back to the beginning. All right, and then there's what it looks like on your vest. So you'll have 5 of those. All right, that is buttonholes. Now, another thing, just one more thing to talk about with buttonholes. So many of the, as we know, as I'm sure we all know, because all of us have at some point been shopping to buy clothes, clothing is very much sold gendered, right? And there's a very few things in construction that are gendered other than dealing with body shapes. And if you're tailing something to a body type, it doesn't matter. You're just building it to that body. Um, but buttonhole placement is actually gendered. So men's buttonholes are traditionally on, or the buttonholes in clothing made for men is traditionally on the left-hand side. And for women, it's traditionally, for front closures, it's traditionally the buttonholes are on the right-hand side. I'm not entirely sure why. There's been a lot of studies. There's speculation about men dressing themselves, and most people are right-handed, so it's easier to push a button through with your right hand. So the buttons are on the right and the holes are on the left. And then speculation that traditionally women have had people dress them, and therefore so the person dressing them, if the buttonholes are on the right and the buttons are on left, they can use their right hand to push that through. We're not 100% sure if that's it. That's kind of the closest we've come to figuring out why that is. So, and if you're used to wearing the clothing that's ascribed to one gender and you wear clothing with buttons, then you've experienced the buttons being on a particular side, and it feels awkward or odd when you encounter buttons that are on the opposite side from what you're used to. So if you are making this vest for a particular person who ascribed whatever gender they ascribe to and whatever gendered clothing they traditionally buy, just remember that men's wear buttonholes are traditionally on the left, and women's wear buttonholes are traditionally on the right. There's a silly little saying that we have to try to remember that. It's called women are always right and men get what's left over. That's just one of those little kind of mnemonic devices to try to remember which side gets which buttonholes. But again, you can put them on whichever side you want. I just wanted to give you a little bit of background about the tradition, because again, if you're making this for someone who ascribes to a particular gender who has traditionally bought clothing of that gender, then they're going to be used to having their buttons on a particular side of the garment. All right, so that is our vest. Once you get those buttons and buttonholes in, it is now fully functional, closures, etc., etc. I hope that you've learned a lot from the project, and thank you very much for joining me.